Hello students, in this unit we'll be looking more deeply at economics as a social science. Writing his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776, Adam Smith, a moral philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution, proposed that a free market economy is capable of achieving an efficient allocation of resources without the need of government intervention. He wanted to replace the very visible hand of government officials with the invisible hand of the free market that would guide resources to their best use and generate the best living standards possible, given unavoidable scarcity. Smith argued that a system in which transactions are voluntary, resources are privately owned, and markets are competitive would be more likely to generate an efficient outcome than would a system controlled by government. Many of Smith's arguments were directed at mercantilists, who advocated government policies that limited imports and restricted trade. The purpose of the protectionist policies advocated by mercantilists is known as bullionism, or the accumulation of gold, which was used to judge the wealth of a nation. By contrast, Smith argued that the wealth of a nation could best be judged by the living standards of its citizens, not the amount of gold held by the government, which depends on the outputs produced and consumed. So when applying the scientific method to the social science of economics, we must take several steps. First, we need to make observations of the world around us and select an economic question we want to answer. Then we must identify variables we think are important to answering that question. We must then make a hypothesis about how the variables are related to each other, make an assumption or make assumptions, and test the hypothesis to see if its predictions fit with what actually happened in the real world. And then compare the predictions of the hypothesis with the real-world outcomes. In order to identify the relationship between two specific variables, other variables that might influence the relationship are assumed to not change. The term ceteris paribus roughly translates as all other things unchanged. The ceteris paribus assumption is used to isolate the relationship between two variables by holding other influences on the relationships constant. For example, the positive statement, quote, quantity demanded falls when the product price rises, ceteris paribus, means that is assumed that another event that would affect the amount purchased, quantity demanded, such as a change in consumer income, is not occurring at the same time as the price changes. So here's a common use of the term. An increase in the amount of hours spent studying economics will lead, ceteris paribus, to an increase in average marks received on economics tests. So as long as there are not unforeseen circumstances, such as getting sick, your house catching on fire, etc., your performance on an economics exam will improve with increased study time, according to this statement. A graph is a model of the relationship between two or more variables. Graphs are frequently used in economics to illustrate and analyze the specific relationships that exist between two variables and how that relationship may change when other influences affecting it change. The independent variable, usually denoted x and plotted on the horizontal axis, has a value that can change freely. The value of the dependent variable, usually denoted as y and plotted on the vertical axes, changes in response to a change in the independent variable. And the value of the dependent variable depends on the value of the independent variable. Basic economic analysis focuses on the relationships between two variables, and the relationship can be graphed on a Cartesian plane. A Cartesian plane is divided into 4 quadrants. Most graphs in economics only use the first quadrant because negative values of many economic variables just don't make any sense. In quadrant 1, the values of both the independent and dependent variables are positive. However, this does not mean there is necessarily a positive or direct relationship between the two variables. A direct or positive relationship exists when a change in the independent variable causes the dependent variable to change in the same direction. This means that an increase in the value of x leads to an increase in the value of y, and vice versa. assuming x is the independent variable and y is the dependent variable. The differing values for the independent variable and corresponding values for the dependent variable can be expressed as a point on a two-dimensional graph. Each point has two coordinates, the x-coordinate and y-coordinate. Direct relationships are graphed as curves that slope upward to the right. The graph of the line between the 2 points, 2, 1 and 5, 4, is shown in quadrant 1 of the Cartesian plane here. The upward sloping line represents a positive or direct relationship between the variables x and y. An inverse or negative relationship exists when a change in the independent variable causes the dependent variable to change in the opposite direction. This means that an increase in the value of x leads to a decrease in the value of y, and vice versa, assuming x is the independent variable and y is the dependent variable. Inverse relationships are graphed as curves that slope upward to the right. The line between point 2, 6 and 6, 0 is graphed on the Cartesian plane above. This downward sloping line represents a negative or inverse relationship between variables x and y. The direction of the line between any 2 points indicates the type of relationship that exists between the two variables. If a direct relationship exists, then the curve will slope upward and to the right, indicating that an increase in the independent variable leads to an increase in the dependent variable. Once a relationship has been identified and tested, a theory can be developed. Economic theories are not necessarily complex. Rather, a good economic theory explains important relationships. Many economic theories that have been widely accepted and applied take on status of law. For example, the law of demand, the law of supply, and the law of diminishing marginal returns. Economic models are designed to simplify reality in an attempt to explain real-world relationships and direct outcomes. One important economic model is the supply and demand model, which is based on theories about demand, supply, and market equilibrium. This model helps explain how prices are used to direct resources to specific uses in a market economy, and to make predictions about how prices and outputs might change when market conditions change. Economic models take many forms, and those used by governments, academics, and businesses in the real world tend to be fairly complicated mathematical and statistical models that require the use of a computer. A basic economics course, however, uses models that are two-dimensional graphs, tables, and simple mathematical equations.